Hi, I'm the Dr. David, and in today's spot video we'll be discussing the Shroud of Turin Part 2. Also, they say there's no such thing as a replica of the Shroud of Turin. Well, once again we have a replica right here of the Shroud of Turin. In the first video, the replica was made by Michelangelo, and this time we have a replica right here made by Leonardo da Vinci. So no replicas indeed. Alright, I admit they're shrunk down a bit, but still a replica. Anyways, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a list of the pros and cons concerning the shroud, and I'll give you my opinion, and you can make your own decision on what you think's going on with is the shroud authentic. Millions of people across the country and the world believe that the Shroud of Turin, via blind faith, is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Finally, the Vatican in 1978 lets a group of scientists examine the shroud. They have it for 5 days and 5 nights. They work 24 hours a day, and they rush the heck out of themselves to get this testing done. The head of that team was Ray Rogers, a chemical scientist, a brilliant man in his field. But when the carbon-14 dates came back, the test dates came back, it said it only dated to the Middle Ages of 1260 up to maybe 1390. 10 years later, a husband and wife who are not scientists, they're looking at these pictures of the shroud from the internet. Anybody can get these pictures of shrouds from the internet. And they noticed that the section of the shroud the samples came from were colored darker than the rest of the shroud. Well, they all agreed that this looks like a technique called French reweaving, which was very popular during the 16th century. They present this information to Ray Rogers, and what's left of the samples from the shroud test, he retests, and sure enough, there's cotton fibers in it, and there is liquid colored dye pigment, dyes, not pink, dye's not a pigment, liquid colored dyes, coloring, it's a coloring, in the cotton. So they had to match the cotton to the linen of the shroud, and of course the linen didn't take any of the dye. So we find out that's why this section of the shroud is darker in that area. Now's where it starts to get interesting. In 1973, Professor Gilbert Reyes took samples. And you thought in 1978 was the first samples they took, didn't you? Took samples which were directly adjacent from where the 1978 team took their samples from. The results were that the area that the samples were taken from was much darker than the rest of the shroud. So there was probably something, contamination there, or reworking on the shroud. But there was something that made this area very questionable, very dubious, an area that you didn't want to take samples from again. And Barry Schwartz, who was the 1978 photographer of the shroud team, he said if they had paid attention to all these different types of photography photos that were taken of the shroud, that they wouldn't have taken a sample from that area. They would have known better. So why in hell did they still take samples from an area that they had to know were, at best, questionable? Let's talk about that they really find no pigments on the shroud, no dyes, no coloration, no coloring whatsoever. The 1978 team made that statement, but the only expert on the team who was an expert in ultramicro particle research analysis of colors and pigments was Dr. Walter McCrone. Dr. Walter McCrone said he found red ochre, red vanillin, and vanillin is a crystalline compound used for coloring, and collagen. These are all commonly used materials used to do characteristics of coloring and coloring during the medieval times. And it has been argued that there wasn't enough of this found on the shroud, and this was contamination from copies that they had laid on top of the shroud and transferred over to the shroud. But McCrone says if that had happened, it would only be on one side of the shroud, but it actually seeped through, so it's on both sides of the fiber. Can't happen if it just laid on top of it. Dry pigments were laid on top of it. It may have gone on one side, but not both. And he's the expert. He's the only expert on the team. Dr. Warren McCrone states that they lack the knowledge to make that determination. Good point, huh? Believers claim that the Shroud of Turin is true, is real, authentic, because when you line up the top and the bottom of the face, you could run a laser straight through and everything lines up perfect. Well, in actuality, this is bullshit. A cadaver wrapped with cloth does not line up perfect. It would be distorted, it would be out of sync, it would not line up. But you can get one without the distortion. It's called a bas relief iron sculpture, and they're flat. So you use a flat top and a flat back for the front and back of the head. They're also called bas relief sculptures. And when you heat them, you get this image burned onto the cloth, and when you take them off, the cloth lines up perfect that you can put a laser through, they line up perfect. So what they're saying is bullshit. It's just the opposite. It's proof that the shroud is not authentic. Also, the shroud team said that it was oxidized, dehydrated linen, or the cloth looked like it was oxidized, dehydrated linen. Well, this is what linen looks like when you heat it. So you could heat it using this bas relief, and then you would get the perfect shroud. It shows, emits light under ultraviolet light. Okay, so let's get rid of that. We get rid of that by using indirect light, using chemical heating, and then you don't get this fluorescence of light. Well, and there's an illustration called the Prey Manuscript Codex, and this manuscript was created or made in 1190. So they're trying to say that the Templar Knights didn't have it because the manuscript shows a drawing or an illustration of the Shroud of Turin. And it's got the four famous poker holes and the weave and everything that's in the Shroud of Turin. And how does the Shroud of Turin match up so perfect? This must be an illustration showing the real shroud. And then the Shroud of Turin is the real shroud. But anyways, the fact is the Templar Knights were an official organization in 1118, which would have put this whole thing happening right during the 100 years while the shroud was missing, and the Templar Knights claimed that they had it, just like I said in part 1. So maybe the Prey Manuscript Codex was the blueprint for the shroud, or vice versa. So details of what? Nothing. It doesn't mean anything. It's bullshit. Also, some trivia knowledge here. The man in the shroud is about 6'1". The average Israelite back in Jesus' day was about a foot shorter, about 5'1". There's no mention in the Gospel of Jesus being a giant. In 2002, there was a restoration. After that, the Scientific Committee of Advisors for the Vatican advised them to place it in a box that the inside was coated with a crystalline, colorless preservative called thymol. Thymol is used for embalming, or as a fungicide or antiseptic. It's used to kill bugs, stop the growth of bacteria. But what this did is it totally contaminated the shroud. Now, back in 1532, when the fire damaged the shroud, they snipped off 16 pieces of charred fabric. Now, charred fabric is very, it's probably not contaminated, but if it is contaminated, it's very easy to clean the contamination out of it. So we've already got this, and the church is like, we don't want to damage the shroud anymore. Bullshit. It's already been cut. The samples have already been cut. It won't damage the shroud. But they won't let us test them. Now, the shroud is supposed to be the only piece of material that is a miracle, a magical, and we can't reproduce it. But Leonardo da Vinci, as I mentioned, who drew this replica, Leonardo da Vinci made the John the Baptist painting. There's no brush marks on it. You can x-ray it, you can use magnifying electron microscopes, you do all kinds of stuff. You can't see any brush marks on it, no knife marks. You know how they use a knife or a putty knife to paint with? No marks at all. It cannot be reproduced, and it's a total mystery to modern science. Anyways, we're out of time. So what is the church afraid of? Until the church lets us test these samples and give us a true carbon-14 dating of the shroud and a true thorough examination of the shroud, as far as I'm concerned, we should think of it as a forgery. Because what is the church hiding that they know that they don't want us to know? Anyways, I talk about all this in my book, Bible Babble Bull. It's very important to you to realize that this is Bible Babble Bull 2nd edition. It doesn't say 2nd edition on the cover, but it's 2nd edition. It says so on the inside and the back cover. And that's about it. I'll be signing off in a second. Oh. one more thing. I'm the father David, and if you think that the Shroud of Turin, she's too much a perfectamente, that it must be a miracle, then you must be to the pazza en la cabeza, and an intelligent design in a force. I'm the Dr. David, have a great life.